It's a real joy to be here. And Jen and Hal, you've created such an amazing space for us all to be in, and I thank you so much for inviting me to be part of that and for continuing to provide, an amazing space, so much information, but with such warmth and such spirit. It's a joy to be here, so thank you. And I know that wouldn't be possible without the Rudds and their commitment to this work, this research program, and everybody here, because we come into these rooms with our hearts and our minds and our spirits ready to learn and facing some pretty tough realities. So I thank Gary for setting us up, and I want to congratulate the Rudd Research Program for 10 years. You haven't just been doing this for a short time, you've been doing it for a long time, so that longevity does not go underappreciated. So thank you. So now I want to introduce our panel, and I really feel so, full of joy and happiness at embarking on a conversation that's going to be filled with challenges and things that aren't going to be easy. But the fact that we have assembled this panel of amazing human beings and just with so much information and just the ability and the just being able to share their personal journeys is just something I have a lot of respect for. And I'm going to start with Amani Myers. Amani is a dynamic public speaker and a child welfare advocate. She's a native of Boston, and Amani recently received her Master's of Public Administration degree with the National Urban Fellows Program in 2017. I was there to see her get awarded this as part of a reception. It was a beautiful day. In this prestigious program, Amani was placed in the California Endowment located in Oakland, California, where she worked on My Brother's Keeper, on the My Brother's Keeper initiative for young boys and men of color. Amani previously worked with the U.S. Children's Bureau as a child welfare consultant, as well as interning on both Capitol Hill and the White House Domestic Policy Council, helping influence policy. She graduated from Gordon College with a degree with a double major in social work and sociology, and completed her social work and peace and conflict studies practicum in San Francisco. She has also traveled to South Africa to study race, class, and gender. Amani became a ward of the state at birth, and through her experiences in foster care, she became committed to helping others break the cycle of poverty. Amani received a 2016 Re-envisioning Foster Care Champion Award from the Treehouse Foundation in recognition of the contribution she has made to child welfare nationwide. She also was the recipient of the 2017 Ron Gonzalez Memorial Fund Award, where she was recognized by the National Urban Fellows Program for her dedication and demonstration of leadership that promoted Gonzalez's core values and as change agents in the world. Amani is a compassionate and driven individual dedicated to reshaping policies affecting vulnerable populations. Welcome, Amani. Elliot Harrington is currently a doctoral candidate studying are you still a candidate? She is coming off of an amazing trip of defending, and she has now, so this is new, this is hot off the presses. She was studying counselor education at Montclair State University in Montclair, New Jersey. She holds a master's degree in community counseling, also from Montclair State University, and has counseled children, adolescents, adults, and individuals in program and group family settings. Elliot's areas of interest include pedagogy, family studies, and adoption, particularly the experiences of birth parents. Elliot has been a speaker and presenter on the topic of adoption at various local, state, and national conferences, and she is an adoptive mother through domestic open adoption. Welcome, Elliot. Dr. Dana Johnson is a professor of pediatrics and member of the divisions of neonatology and global pediatrics at the University of Minnesota, where he co-founded the International Adoption Program in 1986. I love it. His research interests include the effects of early institutionalization on growth and development and the outcomes for internationally adopted children. He has authored numerous scholarly works, including co-editing Adoption Medicine, published in the Academy of an American Academy of Pediatrics. He also received the Distinguished Service Award and the Lifetime Achievement Award from the Joint Council for International Children's Services, the Friend of Children Award from Holt International. He serves on the board of directors for One Sky and Spoon Foundations, Both Ends Burning, and the National Council for Adoption. He is also a senior fellow at the National Center on Adoption and Permanency and serves on the editorial advisory board of Adoptive Families and the advisory board of the Rudd Research Program. Dr. Johnson has an adopted son from India, 2 birth daughters, and 3 stepdaughters. I first want to acknowledge Kim Stevens was on our panel and for several reasons could not be here, but sends her best, and we miss her terribly. But we have the amazing Sue Badeau, who is an amazing person to come in Kim's place. So thank you so much. We love you, and we're so glad that were willing to come in at the last minute. So I want to introduce Sue. Many of you know her, a nationally known speaker, writer, and consultant with a heart for children and families. After receiving a degree in early childhood education from Smith College, Sue worked for many years in child welfare and juvenile justice systems. She serves on several national boards and is currently president of the North American Council on Adoptable Children. Sue writes and speaks extensively to the public and private agencies, courts, parent groups, and churches. She has worked with the National Child Traumatic Stress Network, A Second Chance, Inc., Justice for Families, All Children, All Families, a program of the Human Rights Campaign, the National Council for Juvenile and Family Court Judges, Casey Family Programs, and was the deputy director of the Pew Commission on Children in Foster Care. Sue has developed a curricula that provides training in all 50 states, several tribal nations, and internationally in North America and Africa. Welcome, Sue. Ridge House is a father, a birth father, and a late discovery adoptee. This means that Ridge found out that he was adopted much later in life. After completing a JD, he completed an MA in English rhetoric as well as an MA in film. For several years, he split time between teaching college courses and working on cable TV shows for National Geographic, Food Network, and Bravo. Ridge House now produces documentaries including 6 Word Adoption Memoirs, 6 Wham, and teaches the next generation of filmmakers. It's great to have you here with us. And last but not least, we have Gary, who we all know and heard from, and thank you again for setting us up. So before we get into the conversation, I just want to spend a couple minutes and first of all, acknowledging and thanking again this panel, because when you're connected personally and professionally to adoption, coming into these spaces and sharing so authentically your personal experiences is not an easy thing to do. So it's so important that we hear, but I want to acknowledge the commitment that is made by people who engage in these conversations and are connected. It seems like every time I'm preparing for something like this, there's something in the news that reminds me how urgent our work is. And this image right here, I don't know if you all have been seeing it and understanding what happened to the Hart family. In 2014, a photo of Devontae Hart weeping while hugging a police officer became viral after all of the rallies and riots in Ferguson, Missouri. Now, this picture served as a symbol of hope following the murder of Michael Brown. Fast forward to the most recent news of the horrific abuse that Devontae and his siblings suffered, and ultimately their death as their adoptive mother drove them and her partner off a cliff. Sarah and Jennifer Hart, both 38, were killed, and children Marcus 19, Jeremiah 14, Abigail 14 also died. I know Hannah, who's 16, Serena, who's 15, and Devontae, who's 15. We believe that those children also perished, but I think daily they're looking for those bodies, and I believe some of them have been found, or they think they have, so I don't know where that stands. But these harsh realities take our breath away, they break our hearts, and I can only hope they motivate us to double down, to challenge the most critical elements of adoption and foster care and family today. What I've learned is that in order that we meet these challenges, it's critical that we frame the bigger pictures of adoption, similar to how Gary did this morning, and listen to the voices of those closest to the experience. Makes us uncomfortable, but that's kind of too bad. There are 5 key elements that I've settled on over the last year. One, adoption is not a one-time transaction, it's a lifelong journey. We must recognize the basic human rights for all human beings in the extended family of adoption. Children are not commodities. I want you to notice the different colors of the babies up there and the different price tags. Subtle, but we get it based on what Gary said and what we all probably have experienced in some way, shape, or form. Adoption in America lacks uniformity. There's a patchwork of laws, policies, and practices across the country, makes our work even more difficult and does not serve families. And last, really, there'll be no reform without education. It feels so urgent that these concepts are at the center of our work, but not just our work. These concepts need to mushroom out to the places of leadership. Gary mentioned the adoption ladies. It's critical that people who fund our work, who are in leadership positions and positions of power, also center on these core concepts, and they're vastly different than what they used to be. This morning we're going to touch on 3 areas based on Gary's ideas: truth, consequences, and reform. So with that, I'm going to join the panel and get this conversation going. So here we go. To turn on my mic, everybody's mic's on. Good. Okay. I gotta give mine a second. Hold on. Here we go. We good? Oh, we're good. I love it. Okay. So I was very purposeful in having Amani go first, because to me, when we talk about adoption not as a one-time transaction, I think about when I first realized in my early 20s that not everybody gets adopted. Being a transracially adopted person, I knew I was adopted. We didn't talk about it in my house. Wasn't a thing for everybody else. It was only a thing for me, right? So when I went on my own journey and I walked into a foster care agency, and I realized that these young people that I was about to work with, not all of those young people are going to get adopted. And I think that's the most important place to start. So I wanted to start with Amani in thinking about this idea of the truth and understand a little bit about how your truth and your experiences have framed and given you a pathway to what you want to do and are doing so beautifully professionally.
Well, thank you. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for posing that question. So at the age of 12, I was at my after-school program in Boston, Massachusetts, and I was living with my mom at the time. My social worker showed up at the after-school program and brought my 2 other siblings and I into a conference room and shared with us that we were going to be separated from my mother. There was no explanation, there was no questions. We just kind of, left the after-school program. I was in the middle playing basketball. Went to the DCF office at first to pick up my belongings that were in the middle of the floor. And we then began to go to our destination. So they brought my brother and I into a home. My sister was there. And they were just trying to explain to us what was going on. And at that time, I learned that my little sister, who I spent 12 years with, along with my brother, was being separated from us. And so, as you can imagine, the impact and trauma that experienced. So, not only are you being removed from your mother's care, but you're also being removed from a sibling who you spent your entire life with. And so, I went into this foster home as a temporary means, and then went into a more permanent home, because there's where we found out that we were being taken permanently, and that DCF had the custody of us. And so I remember asking my foster mother about being adopted, and at the time I had just turned 14, and I remember her telling me that I was too old to be adopted. My younger sister, who was about 2 years younger, was not, apparently. And so I think having that framework so young, I just had the idea that I was not adoptable, and that I was just gonna move through the system and exit out of care and wasn't gonna have a permanent family. And so as I've grown older, what I've learned is that it wasn't necessarily that I wanted to be adopted. I wanted to be with my biological family. I wanted to have a normal family. I wanted my family to be supported. But at that time, it wasn't going to happen. And so again, I had to find my own means. Thankfully, I had a high school teacher and a high school principal who stepped in and just kind of advocated for me and was there for me, and to this day are still in my life. And so what I learned was that permanency extended beyond adoption. Permanency extended beyond, just being thrown out at age 18 with nowhere to go, and realizing that people in my life were going to be there to support me. And so as I've done my work around child welfare advocacy and working with young people in foster care and learning their stories and working with agencies who are helping young people transition, I realized that what worked for me was having access to social capital, was being able to be given opportunities and connected to mentors and support systems who were going to support me. And so as I think about and navigate around this issue around adoption and what does that mean, and not being able to gain permanency, I realized that stability for me, I had to define it for myself. And so it has not always been easy, and I do understand the importance of adoption because I realize that not all young people will be adopted. And so if not all young people will be adopted, how do we support these young people where they're at? I also have become to realize as well that, as April mentioned earlier with the Hart family, there are countless other young people who are in these situations. And so if these young people are going to be adopted, how do we support them in the ways that they need to be supported? And from a framework that's going to move beyond well-being to stability.
Okay. Yes. Thank you so much. And you gave me a great segue to talk to Sue, because Sue has a deep and personal connection, professional connection to adoption and foster care. And one of the themes that also come up is this idea of identity. And we often sort of place identity and healthy identity development on young people, right? And we have to help them develop it, but we can't kind of reflect on ourselves as grown-ups and adults and parents and supports for these young people. So I want to talk about healthy identity development and the idea of how you have had that become a center of gravity as a parent and professional, but you've taken it on yourself too, and you and your husband. So can you talk a little bit about that and why that's so important to this bigger picture?
Sure, absolutely. Thank you. And again, as Monty said, good morning, and thank you for having us here and having this conversation. It's really exciting to be able to open up some of these really provocative and maybe so uncomfortable conversations. Our first adoption, my husband and I adopted our first child in 1979 here in Western Massachusetts. We were living in Northampton at the time. And we went into the thing that got us started on an adoption journey, and we always, even as young kids, we were high school sweethearts, and even as young kids, we had this idea that we were going to build this family differently than the families we had grown up in, and that it would be a lifelong journey. We never sort of thought it was an event, and we never knew that was radical. It took us a while to find out that was different. But we still went into it with this idea that there were children without families, that there were children without families who needed people like us to step up and become a family for children who didn't have families. And so when we talk about identity and we talk about the sort of theme that Gary and you framed us with about truth and consequences and reform, the first part around truth is there is no such thing as a child without a family. And until we actually acknowledge that, and there is no child without a family, so there is no need for someone to step in and become a family for a child who doesn't have a family. Every child has a family. No matter what has happened with that family, every child has a family, and that family will forever be part of who that child is. And I'll talk about this a little later in my workshop on well-being, but we often hear the family tree assignment for 6th graders is problematic for children who've been adopted, and one of the variations that is sometimes suggested is the rooted tree. And the rooted tree is often presented as, okay, the roots are the birth family, and then the branches are the adoptive family, or something like that. But my view of this identity question is that trees have root systems, and we're all the adults and all the siblings and all the extended family and all that, those other people that you talked about, they become all part of the root system. And it's complex, it's not simple, it can be messy, but that's all part of the root system that contributes to the identity. So when we were adopting our first son, a mom, an adoptive mom in the community. We owned a bookstore at the time in Northampton, and an adoptive mom who was also a customer in the store. She came in, and we were so excited. Our son was going to be coming, and we were, sharing because we knew she was an adoptive mom. And she said these words. She said, "Never forget that your joy of receiving this child into your family is first built on someone else's pain." Mm-hmm. And that just kind of stopped us in our tracks and started a lifelong journey for us of exploring what does this really mean and what is identity. And so from that point on, we really tried to explore it ourselves, my husband and I. We adopted many more children after that. We were foster parents for many others. And we always tried to have the idea that their family of origin, their birth family, their former foster families, all the other people, siblings that weren't biological to first of all, siblings that they never should have been separated from, like you talked about, but also siblings they grew up with in foster care who they never did have a biological connection to, so no one thought about those relationships in terms of separation or not. That these were all part now of our extended family, that we couldn't be a family and we couldn't raise this child without acknowledging that. So there are children who don't have adults who can raise them right now, and there still is a need for these other ways of building families where other adults can raise a child. But that doesn't mean there's a child without a family, and that the more we can really look at that whole tree and that whole root system as part of our own extended family and as part of the identity that not only that child has, but it then becomes part of our identity as well. And so it changes our whole sense of who is our family identity. And just one last comment I'll make on that is one of our daughters who was adopted as a young adult, similar to Gary's daughter, and she's also not of our same race. And she's developmental. She's our daughter that's like a twin of Gary's daughter. We talk about this, but she also has developmental challenges. But she speaks sometimes on panels like this or speaks with me. And she was talking about what it's like to be adopted as an older. That was the theme. That was what she was supposed to be talking on. But immediately when it was time for questions, people asked her, well, what's it like to grow up being black with a white family? And she said, well, I don't have a white family and I don't have white parents. And I was in the room. And people knew I was her mother. And so I could see people's faces like, poor girl. She's so confused. But then she elaborated. She said, my mom is Spanish and Italian, and this was before 23andMe as well. My mom is Spanish and Italian, my dad is French Canadian, I have brothers and sisters from India, and this and that. She said, our whole family, that's our whole family, all of those things. And I think that's, the identity has to honor the individual identity as deeply and broadly as possible, but also figure out how we all are able to share, like that complex root system, share that identity.
Well, Sue, it's a testament to your radical thinking. And the good news is your radical thinking now gets spread across the world, quite frankly. And I'm going to go to Ridge next. This is a perfect setup. Grown-ups have to be the ones who lead that path, right? They need to lead the way. And when they don't honor the truth, they don't make the space. It's a testament that your daughter would say, well, my mother isn't white, or my family isn't white. It's not either or, it's both and. And when you create the space, well, that's powerful. But, people like Rich House, myself, grew up in an era of secrecy, shame, and a lack of information. And what's amazing, and what I feel like is both the truth and the future in adoption, is that we have to acknowledge and honor what happens when people don't live in the truth. And I think, Rich House, your experience as being a late discovery adoptee, a birth father, you, to me, I've always felt this since knowing you and thinking about what's gone on in the last year for you. You have claimed your truth of adoption even when people around you, namely grown-ups, with this competing interests of adults and lack of truth, weren't able to. Can you talk a little bit about that for you and why claiming even your name and who you wanted to be your parents was so important to you?
Yeah, I'm happy to. Can you hear me okay? No. Have I done something wrong? Do you need to borrow Sue's? I have a green light. Yeah. I'm going to borrow yours. Hello.
Here we go. Thank you.
Hi, April. Happy to.
Hi.
Hello all. For my birthday last year, I asked my birth mother if she would adopt me. Actually, I saw it as an unadoption. And I had some friends come and celebrate. When I was 35, I found out that I was adopted because someone from the state said, your birth mother would like to be in touch with you. And I said, I think you mean Zach's birth mother, the son that I gave up, wanted to be in touch with me. And the social worker said, no, your birth mother. I said, well, that can't be because I'm not adopted. So,
Guys, I think we can't hear in the back. Is there someone that can help with the mic situation up here, or we can give him one? Anybody?
Oh.
There we go.
Am I doing it
Okay,
wrong?
we got it. I think we got it.
we got it?
I think so. If people can hear in the back, we got it. If they can't, we don't got it.
Thumbs up?
In the back, talk.
Louder? I'm soft-spoken by nature, so mics don't always help.
Well, they do now.
Okay, so start where?
What was your birthday?
It's my birthday.
You decided, becoming a late discovery deputy, you got the call from the state.
State called, I'm 35 years old, and they said, that your birth mother would like to be in touch with you. I said, that can't be, you must mean Zach, my relinquished son. And they said, no, you're adopted. Which, at 35 was quite a shock, having 5 other children who were growing up in my house and being in an open adoption relationship with my relinquished son. That was surprising. When I wanted to find out more from my adoptive family about that, they had chosen to keep it secret, much like Gary's story. And what about my right to know? Here I am, an adult. I had some medical issues as a junior high student, and I remember going to a doctor, sitting through exams, and every time my adoptive mother was sitting there filling out my family medical history, knowing that that would not help my doctors determine anything. So this last year, I decided for my birthday I wanted to be unadopted by my birth mother and start that whole process over.
And what I want to know, first of all, that's amazing and kind of badass, to be honest, and I hate to curse, but it's true. It's like, so the thing we have to realize is if we don't, as professionals and parents and people in leadership positions, take some more real, authentic control of some of these situations, people are going to take it anyway. And I think that's happening. And it's not just happening with grown-ups. I work with a lot of young people who know they're adopted, have what's called, they think is an open adoption. They know they have a birth mother out there, know that there's a picture somewhere but haven't seen it. And that child is saying, hey, you know that person you told me about who's my birth mother? I want to meet her. I want to meet her like now. And guess what? They went to meet her birth parents. So like it's younger people, given that this is opened up in some ways, are saying, hey, what about me? And we're doing that in all kinds of ways. So I honor that you did that. And quite frankly, people go, what, you changed your name? You did, what? It's so radical. But it's not that radical when you're sitting there and you want to know pieces and parts of yourself. I think, so I so appreciate that. And I'm going to move to Elliot because the other sort of radical thing that we're doing now is listening to birth parents and wanting to know about them and wanting to understand their work. And I know you have a vested interest in this topic professionally and personally. And so we're starting to hear the voices a lot more clearly and having the research there to carry that even further. So I want you to tell us a little bit about your lifelong journey and where it's brought you today in terms of what you're really interested in professionally.
Thanks, April. Oh, good, I can be heard. So my first encounter with adoption was when I was right out of college. I became pregnant and was not prepared to parent. And so as a result of being pregnant and not married, I lost all of my friends. My church totally rejected me. My family rejected me. And I actually lost my job. I was working at a private school, and they said that you can stay here if you get an abortion and we'll pay for it, or you can lose your job. So as a result of losing my job, I actually became homeless. And so at this point, I decided that I could not parent this child. And before I started to plan to make an adoption placement, and before the child was born, she was stillborn. So I've had some of the experiences that birth mothers may have had as far as having a lot of the social and institutional pressures in your life as far as being unacceptable in society for being pregnant and not ready to parent. But I have not lost a child through adoption. So, however, when I went to get my PhD in counseling, I decided that I really wanted to investigate what the experiences were of women who were placing their child for adoption. My experiences were from the mid-1980s, and I wanted to see, in the year 2000 forward, what's going on? And unfortunately, I'm finding that not much positive has happened from what the experiences that I'm hearing from the women that I've talked to. I also wanted to know what their counseling experiences were, besides their pre-placement experiences, what their counseling experiences were, and how prepared they felt that their counselors were to address their issues. And I'm finding some very sad things about that too, and I don't want to be Debbie Downer here, but it was discouraging and yet encouraging in some ways, because the women that I talked to in my study that I did for my dissertation actually had found ways to make their counseling work for them, because they are resilient, because they are problem solvers. So we'll talk in a few minutes about some of the things that they feel like they were missing out in their therapy that might help us kind of move forward so that they are not kept in this vulnerable position, but move forward with their lives in the way that is best to integrate their experiences, and also to help the adoptees to have holistic lives, holistic wellness and holistic lives in their going forward from their adoption experience.
Well, thank you, Elliot, for sharing such personal information, and we honor that. We honor you and all that you've experienced, and thanks for sharing with us. And on the same theme of sort of engagement and preparation, I know, Dana, your work has centered largely, and you fiercely believe in this idea of preparation, and not seeing this as just transactional, at the true, authentic discussion, and then true medical practice that comes with that. And I want to hear from you on the belief system that you have, that all this education has to happen well in advance of an adoption, right? You firmly believe in that in your work.
Well, I do, and thank you very much, April, and it's a pleasure to be with you here today. When we get involved in our clinic at the point where parents are sent a referral, and they send us the information, and we help interpret the medical information for them. We firmly believe that parents need to know what they're in store for. We need to know that they feel comfortable taking care of the medical needs of the child. We don't want to put a child in a family where they can't do that. What we believe is that what their expectations are and what the reality is, the difference between the two of those is disappointment. And we don't want families to be disappointed. We want them to be realistic, and we want to have realistic expectations for them. The problem is that whenever we talk about having children, part of our brain goes to sleep. And the cognitive part, where we can analyze things very nicely, is totally overwhelmed by the emotional part of our brain. And this happens with birth children, this happens with adopted children, and suddenly we revert to that narrative that everything is going to turn out to be okay. So what we have to make sure is that parents understand that these are things that they're going to have to face. It's very difficult, and I don't think it's gotten a whole lot easier. Maybe back in the early 90s, when we started seeing kids come from Romanian orphanages, and the agencies were telling families that all you have to do is give them a lot of food and a lot of love, and everything is going to turn out okay, was no longer true. And people are willing to look a little bit more analytically at the issues that they may have to face with their children. But I think we have made progress in making sure that families do understand that of the issues they're going to face, particularly the emotional issues related to the early trauma, are going to be very important.
Well, thank you for all the work that you do. I know it's foundational to helping families and helping children be stronger. With all that, I'm gonna anchor on Gary a little bit on this section. You got to get your mic back. You talked provocatively in your opening. Can you share a little bit more about why you think it's so important to be provocative now, and what are some more ways that we can be provocative in order to move things forward?
I mean, I think, I've always been provocative. Hal invited me to come and talk, so it was a good forum. I think, I don't know, I just think that we sometimes just become too complacent doing the same old, and I think that we need to shake it up a bit in the sense of saying, are we really doing what's best for children and families that we work with and that we're part of? And I've never been afraid of kind of looking beyond the little box that we get put in, right? So I think that we need to kind of keep challenging people to do that. And I think, I'll say another thing too. I think I made a kind of offhanded comment about following the money and grants and stuff like that. That's a big part of it. I mean, you accept the public dollar, you do the public work, and if you challenge too much, they're very clear about the fact that you're not going to get funded again. So I think there's a great benefit to receiving public money and receiving funds to do research, to do programs, to do practice, but there's also a drawback. My federal project officer, who was from Texas, used to tell me all the time, Gary, if you keep talking about all this stuff that we don't want to hear about, we're not going to fund you anymore. I mean, she was very direct. I remember thinking that was kind of horrifying. Maybe I shouldn't have taken the money. And then it's not all about money, but it's also about the freedom to say the things that need to be said and not to be afraid that you're going, because we work for these organizations too. I worked for a school that was very happy to have those millions of dollars. And I put them at risk as well by saying provocative things. So I think, you need to be able to have the freedom to kind of do things differently and think a little bit differently and maybe challenge differently. And I think that's a really great place to be. I'm very happy to not have any of that money now because I can say the things that I want to say and not worry about getting a phone call later saying you shouldn't have said that, and that's part of it.
Right, and I think it sets up this idea that, I don't know that we've always seen, certainly in my time growing up and being, having the experience of being adopted, it was always like, oh, you're so lucky, and until I felt it unlucky as I tried to search for my birth family, and there were lots of things that happened as a result of that. Using language that we see as not tied to adoption for so long, which is this idea of human rights. What are the human rights layers to? Is it a civic and human right or a civil and human right to have access to our original birth certificates and information that belongs to us as adopted people? These are constructs that are reserved for other things that don't usually have anything to do with adoption. So I love putting human rights next to adoption because I think it's really important, and it kind of takes people by surprise because it's not the general way that we've thought about it. So Elliot, I'm going to start with you on this section about the danger of failing to recognize the human rights pieces and parts to adoption, and the need for an urgent cultural shift around these elements. So starting with you, adoption can seem like a set of transactions, check the box, instead of the transformational experience it really is. So I wanted you to talk a little bit more about the research you've conducted most recently of women who have voluntarily relinquished their parental rights. And I do think it's important that we talk in terms of what the experiences are. This is a voluntary relinquishment, right, that you were looking at. There's a lot of involuntary relinquishment. So there's also a need to put some of these experiences closer together, because I think what we'll find is that there are similar emotions and feelings and realities for both. It seems like more often than not, we tend to find more interest in some ways in the voluntary relinquishment for some obvious reasons, maybe not so obviously. If not so obvious to you, come and talk to me after. But Elliot, tell us a little bit more about what you're finding, as you alluded to in your first statement.
All right, thank you very much. Well, talking about transactional, the transactional aspects of adoption, many of the women that I talked to felt that they were kind of part of a commodified transaction, and that after they gave the commodity, which was their child, to this institution called adoption, that they were kind of left by the roadside to fend for themselves. And because of what I focused on a lot was post-placement counseling, they found that there really wasn't a place for them to go to get that counseling. And that when they did, they were met with a lot of these fallacies about adoption that we see in the general public, and that also a lot of these counselors had kind of gone along for the ride with these ideas and ideals about adoption. So I think the first thing, though, that I saw was actually honoring the commitment, their right to have their commitment to openness honored was something that I didn't see a lot of. A lot of the women had thought they were entering into open adoptions, and then the adoptions would either be closed from the very beginning or would be open for a while and then close. And I understand that these are very complex relationships that we're dealing with as far as openness, but at the same time, this was a basic understanding of theirs that they were going to have this in their relationship with their child, and then were denied it. And those were the individuals who seemed the most affected, most negatively affected by their experiences. And then secondly, I think that it would be it's imperative that we have a more realistic understanding of adoption, as far as thinking it's this wonderful, solution to a problem that we have in society. A lot of the birth mothers that I worked with were told that they were saints and that they were, just so wonderful to do what they were doing, and they felt that really denigrated their experiences because they didn't feel like they were saints. They felt like they were people who had made very difficult decisions. And then finally, I think, as I know this call has gone up so often over the years that I've been coming to RUD and coming to so many other conferences, just the call for effective counseling for these women after they've placed, and yet getting very ineffective and sometimes harmful. I found several of the women were actually harmed by their counseling experiences post-adoption, and just trying to educate, I believe, is the key. Educating those individuals who are going to be out there in the field, working with individuals who are part of the adoption constellation is the call that I see going up.
And I think it's happening more and more. And one of the ways that I'm so inspired, there's one thing to have the research body of work that it's critically important. There's a lot of it. I feel like we've got a lot to work with. It feels like we don't always act on that, which we know, but it's there. There's not a lot of black holes right now. There's still much more to learn, but there is so much that we already know. So I think that, and then coupled with that, I think there's a real need for creative expression around the experiences, and that's Ridge, where you have really created space. So I want you to talk a little bit about your 6-word adoption memoirs project. And what do you, when you look at the narratives that you're pulling together from the people closest to the adoption experience, what are you seeing as a human rights element to that just shines really bright as you watch these narratives and bring them to all of us?
Okay, I'll take that in 2 parts.
Great.
First is just 6-word adoption memoirs. Has anyone seen the documentary 6-word adoption memoirs? Good. So you're familiar. For those of you that aren't, a few years ago, my film partner Derek Frank and I, we were in a session with Jean Strauss, and she said if she were starting over, if she were telling stories for the first time, she would tell more stories and shorter stories. Derek and I connected over that and started to brainstorm for the next year about how do we capture more voices, how do we tell more stories, how do we let more people share, because there is a danger of a single story in adoption, and that it's this great thing, which is not to say that it can't be. But when we just spoke with people who were impacted by adoption, there weren't always great stories. And so we wanted to give voice to them, hence the 6-word adoption memoirs. So we try to keep each story to about 2 minutes long so that you can get in, hear what somebody has to say, and then get out. For us, as an artistic expression, we had no idea what it was going to look like, but we've been very pleased with how people have responded to it. And I remember when we were cutting the first 6-word adoption memoirs, I was still crying hearing the stories for the 80th time, as I was going through that. And when we showed it, when we premiered it the first time, like I couldn't talk. It was a talk back at the end and I couldn't talk. And those stories, they are the range of experiences. We have some clear gaps. One of the things that we've tried to do is hear from more inter-country adoptees. We lack those stories because for the most part it's been self-selected individuals who come and talk to us. In terms of human rights, there's a lot of people who still don't know who their family is. They can do 23andMe, they can find out some of the medical information, but in terms of their identity, they lack that. Their ability to express, to talk through that, I think, has some catharsis for them, but there's still a lot of needs, and so we're still cutting stories. There's no end.
Well, and then it's sort of back to this idea. There's the narrative, and then there's like what's really true. And Dana, your work around, being humane about the placement of children, especially, related to securing placement for children and young people in their medical care. So can you talk a little bit about that? Because I feel like, there's the narrative and there's like some emotional stories that we all have, but then there's like the hard and fast facts of what is true and what is needed from a medical perspective. So can you talk a little bit about that? Because I think they all work together in some kind of a way.
Well, they do. And again, going back, we want to make sure that families understand the type of situation that they're getting into. We see people with enormous willingness to take on challenges. And that's wonderful. But if they are unable to really deal with the issues that the children have, that becomes a problem. I remember one family who wanted to adopt 2 children with significant orthopedic problems that required them to carry them around, but the mother had a back problem and she couldn't carry anything. And they were far away from any kind of big medical center. And so having them realize that even though they may have the desire to do it, that maybe another set of children might be a better fit for them. And I think that goes for the emotional issues too. We see families who want to adopt sibling groups. And they're often sibling groups that have been raised in utter poverty and with no supervision, living on the street, and been exposed to alcohol and drugs and probably sexual abuse too. And having them understand that the amount of effort that's going to be put into taking care of those kids and how they have to get therapists before they get the children into their family and invest in making sure that those kids get the appropriate care is extraordinarily important for them.
Right. Well, and I think it's just a reminder that knowledge is power, right? Knowledge is real power. And what struck me so before you said is talking about children and family, and if you're a potential parent, a prospective parent, and whatever, like part of your brain goes, well, and that's like so powerful and so true. I think sort of in the same idea of brain numbness, I want to stress, it's different but similar. I want to talk to you, Amani, about this idea of human rights and LGBTQ, what is needed in that area, especially around foster youth, because I think sometimes our brains go numb in areas that we don't want to talk about and that we think we've gone beyond and all that. So I know you have a sort of a vested interest in bringing some of this to the table. So tell us a little bit about that for you as we think about that idea.
Yeah, most definitely. So I remember entering into my social work class, intro to social work, so I'm sure many of you social workers are aware when your professor says that, every human has worth, dignity, and value, no matter what. And that really stuck to me because, growing up, you don't always see or experience that. And so I myself am someone who identifies as lesbian. I recently came out last year. And I wasn't someone, who grew up in care where I was seen as someone who was lesbian, even though many people knew. They said that, my aunt said that she knew since I was 10. I didn't, but obviously, yeah, I did. So, but what I realized was that part of it was because I was so focused on surviving. I was focused on trying to heal, trying to escape, all different kind of things. I was so worried about all of these things affecting me and impacting me that I didn't even have a chance to really figure out who I was. And so it wasn't until I was in a more stable place when I mean, it was always a struggle, something I constantly struggled with, but it was something I had to ignore because of everything else I was going through. And so if you can think about many other young people who are in care who may not identify as LGBTQ, and there may be so many young people that do. And so it's like, how do you support these young people who are in these situations? I think what makes it also difficult is when you're in a space where the belief system is different. I grew up in homes where they were very conservative. And so even growing up with my great aunt, it was always, taught to me and thrown down my throat that if you were gay, that you were going to hell. And so at that point, I didn't even have the space to really, think about what it meant to be gay. I was just so focused on trying to, again, what does it mean to be straight? And so how do we support young people who identify as that? And how do we support these young people in places, even if you're not familiar? I think sometimes the danger is that we can often want the person in the situation to educate and to inform. Mm-hmm. And so I think it really becomes the responsibility of the people taking care of you to really get that training and to get that education. Because there's just not enough time in the day for me to really focus on what I'm trying to do while also trying to educate you when you've picked up this role. And so what does it mean for even agencies to support people who are taking in young people who may identify as LGBTQ? How do they become supported? How do they provide them with resources and not necessarily placing it on the child to do and giving them that responsibility? But then also, how do you hold the space of being able to hold on to your beliefs while also still taking on a responsibility that you signed up for? It's like even when you go into the workplace. I mean, if you have certain beliefs or you have different things, I mean, of course, you're going into it with this idea that you share the same values, but I mean, at the end of the day, the value is about love, and the value is about compassion. The value is about dignity and respect. And not necessarily trying to change a person, but being able to help them become all that they can be.
Again, thank you, Amani. In the interest of time, I'm going to go to Sue, and then we're going to go, to the last topic, and then do some audience Q&A. And you can only pick one, Sue. Sorry, only pick one. What do you think is the one most pressing aspect of human rights related to adoption and foster care today?
That wasn't a fair setup.
Nope, it was not.
All. But I think the one core issue really relates to everything everyone's talking about, and even what I talked about in the first question. It is having access to who you are, your identity, that everyone has a human right for that, but also all aspects of that. Gender expression, sexual orientation, race. And there's so many issues in all of that represents human rights. So when I think about it as it relates to adoption, my most pressing and radical piece related to this is that there should not be a legal construct called termination of parental rights. It should not exist. And
thank you.
And so if that did not exist, then we could begin to approach families as extended families and identity and culture. When Ridge was talking, I was thinking one of my daughters, when she was in college, she was in a sociology class, and they were learning about culture and definitions of culture and things, and they were given an assignment to write a paper about a culture that they had personally been part of and experienced. And they had to submit their idea first to the professor before actually writing the paper. And my daughter said, I'm going to write a paper about the culture of adoption. And her professor said, there's no such thing as that's not a culture. You can't write about that. So she spent her next period of time writing a paper that proved to her professor that adoption is a culture. And she got an A, by the way. But, so knowing your identity and honoring it and honoring all the people that are part of that root system I mentioned earlier. So there should not be a termination of parental rights at all as a legal construct, because that's that's kind of the fruit of the poison tree, whatever. That's what gets us started on these paths of secrecy, on these paths of squashing parts of identity, on these paths of not acknowledging identity. And I know I work in a lot of tribal nations, and I know in there's a practice called customary adoption that does not rely on termination of parental rights. So there can still be this option and this possibility of parents being able to raise children that aren't born to them, and children being able to grow up in families even if the parents who did give birth to them can't parent them. That's not what I'm saying we should abolish, but the legal constructs that really then lead to all these other human rights issues, I think it's at that core right there. So if I have to pick one, that's what I pick.
Thank you for doing that, because I know that's tough because there's so many, but that is foundational and a center of gravity. I'm going to, also in the interest of time, I'm going to move to topic 3 and switch up the order just a little bit and go with Gary first. Because the thing that Sue anchored on is there's something that I keep I can't get out of my head, which is, we're doing all this work nationwide about unsealing records and opening. I'm like, why are we still sealing them? Right? Like, can we talk about that? Like, because we're fighting this fight that seems like, and it not just seems like, it's 20, 30 years in some places longer. And it's like, okay, that seems like a really hard thing to do when the records are sealed, when the adoption is finalized. So that, and then given that, you talked about DNA and you talked about 23andMe. Why are those things going to be part of what deconstructs adoption and foster care in your eyes?
Well, I think because legally they have this whole system of sealing records, and it's a legal piece. I mean, adoption in the early 20th century was an informal practice without any oversight or guidance, and then state by state and then federally, they started looking at adoption in different ways, and the whole sealing of records and maintaining privacy of the birth parent and such became the issue. And then I think what happened is that people either accept it. Well, I've never really met an adopted person who has no curiosity about where they came from. Never, right? But a lot of times, you have.
Yeah, they exist, and that's not a bad thing. It's just, but it's all over the map. But a lot of people do want to know.
But I think that people started beginning to look at things themselves and finding ways to uncover things themselves. Patricia Martinez-Dorner, who's a colleague of ours in San Antonio, is somebody who is expert at helping. She always call her the adoption detective. I mean, she can find anything out about anybody, but people started utilizing people like her to help find out information about their families because that's what they needed to do. And I think newer things like Facebook and 23andMe and those kind of things allowed people to do that on their own. So that people started to kind of not accept the fact that this was closed and something I couldn't access, but something that I really had a right to have, and I'm going to explore that on my own. Similar to the way that I think in foster care we've said to kids who are older, you can't go home to your family, and we've kept them in care for 18 years. And then we're shocked when they return to their families when they're 18 or 21. It's like, oh, we didn't even know you knew they existed. Yeah, they've been friends on Facebook for 10 years. They've been secretly visiting them because they didn't tell us they were doing that because we would say, oh, you can't do that. So there was all of this kind of wink, wink, behind the scenes stuff that was going on. And I think that people seized opportunities where they could to find out information about their own lives. And I think if the more openness there is, then obviously they don't have to do all that, although they may just want to do that to enhance their understanding of who they are and their identification. But I think it would make it easier if they unsealed records and allowed people to have access to the information that they are entitled, in my opinion, to have.
Yeah, it's also instructive. I mean, that's what you talk about education. We did a simple quiz in the national survey that we did of like 5 simple questions, and those closest to adoption, including birth parents, adopted people, foster parents, foster alum, and the general public, got a C- on some very simple questions related to adoption. So this idea of a lack of education is something we all believe in. This is why we're all here. So I want to start with Amani on this one, and this is our last topic, then we'll move to questions in the audience. We'll keep this one moving a little bit quicker than we have in the others, so because we're running short on time. The basic of education starts with language, and we've had a couple of intense conversations, I think, and I've probably had them with several people about the language of adoption and the shifts that need to happen, even in institutional language, surrounding race and quite frankly, institutional racism that shows up in the language of adoption, and I want Amani for you to talk a little bit about that and why it's so important that we just at least even talk about the fact that it feels really uncomfortable, and it's like language in laws and policy, and we use this language, it sort of rolls off our tongue.
Yeah, most definitely. I would say the first thought that comes to my mind is emancipation.
And what that is emancipation from?
From foster care. So basically that you're leaving. And they also use the term aging out. But I think that, when describing, working with youth and working with people, language is so important because it really does inform how you do behave, and it does inform how you will work with that person. And so even being told at the age of 14 that I was too old to be adopted, the language around that in itself, what does that do for the mindset of a 14-year-old? The mindset of telling someone they're too damaged to go back home, or that their parents are damaged, or that you're going to end up just like your parents. These were words that I constantly heard growing up. And so it's kind of like, how do you move through the oppression of society, this oppression that's going on in your home, even the inner oppression that you're going through for yourself? It's like that you're constantly fighting through these different things that you're facing. And so even when we are creating policies that have to do with, the language, it's like you have to really, really be careful in how you frame things, because in the ways that we're framing things is how people are going to operate.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you.
Yeah, I want to be short.
No, that was great. It was perfect. And I'm going to move to Dana now. And Dana, I want, and I'm going to, I think, Sue, ask you a similar question, just so you know. You talk a lot about the bureaucracy and the processes and the administration, which sometimes can impede. Where do you think the most education is needed? And how do you think you sort of re-educate people? Because this seems like it's been a problem forever, this idea of things moving too slow, or not just having the right information about how things should move on behalf of children and their safety. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, I think this is a huge issue. There are three things that have been well established in child development over the last 30 years. And one is that most brain development occurs very early in life. The second is that while your genes are important, your environment is really what makes a difference in terms of your brain development. And the third thing is that there are sensitive periods for very important functions in terms of brain development. So when we look at what happens on kids living under very adverse circumstances, we have found out that if kids live in those circumstances for over 2 years, they don't have as good cognitive abilities. If they live in it over first 18 months, then they don't have as good language. And if they live in it for longer than 12 months, they don't grow as well. And the most striking thing is, if they live in adverse circumstances where they're not nurtured for longer than 4 to 6 months, they are at higher risk for psychiatric problems in the future. So how many have had a court case? Okay? How many of those court cases proceeded rapidly? None. And when we talk about kids in the child welfare system, they're there often for a very long period of time. So it's absolutely critical that we educate lawyers, judges, child protection workers, etc., about how important it is to come to a conclusion about permanence and a good environment for this child to develop in. I think that would drastically improve the outcome for these kids.
You also spend a fair amount of time, if not a lot of time, on inter-country adoption. Oh, duh. Okay, sorry. Dana, you also spend a fair amount of time with inter-country adoption.
Well,
correct?
sure. We spend a lot of time in talking with governments about orphanage care, and they're absolutely astonished that this way of caring for kids that it's been established for so many years is so disastrous to how these kids are going to do in the future. So they understand that it's a bad thing. So the problem there is trying to get them to change things. And it's very difficult to do, but we are seeing, once they have the information, that they are willing to at least try and speed up the process for permanence.
Good, thank you. And Sue, you travel across the country, around the world. What's the thing you knock your head against the wall on? Like, you know, like, you're like, again, I have to talk, like, what? Why haven't we learned this lesson? What do you think?
So I'm going to build a little on what was just said, but I think that what you said at the very beginning too, April, and Gary certainly said, adoption is not a one-time event, it's not a transaction, it's a lifelong experience, it's a journey. I mean, sometimes that just rolls off like a cliche, but for people to really get what that means, and therefore that it's going to require new levels of education all along the years. So it's a lifelong process, but it's also not a do-it-yourself project for anyone involved. That you need others, I need others, we all need others, and part of who we need is all of the members of our children's family, their birth family, and part of who we need are the professionals, and part of what we need is that type of information that Dana just shared, but what we also need is hope. Like, yeah, there can be these dire challenges, and you need to be prepared for them and equipped for them, and you can make a difference. And children can heal, but they heal in the context of relationships. You don't send them somewhere to go heal and then say, now come join my family now that you're healed. And so that piece, that there is this vast amount of information. And so everyone, it's judges and lawyers, I spent a lot of time with them too, but guidance counselors at high schools and nurses at ERs. These are sometimes the first contact, or in some cases the only contact, that people involved with adoption have with a potentially helping professional who doesn't have any of this information or only has the bad outcome information and not the what can you do next to have hope information. And then in terms of the child welfare system, everyone needs education, but I always focus on there's a really critical need to ensure that people at that supervisory level have far better support for developing supervisory skills than they have, because the way it works now in most places is you gruel it out, you put in some time as a caseworker, and if you're lucky one day, you become a supervisor. And yet, they're the ones that really set the tone of how workers are going to work with families and what kind of language they're going to use and what kind of expectations they're going to set. So within child welfare, I'd say supervisors, but outside of child welfare, I say, and the education, even for families, has to be offered and continued 2 years later, 5 years later, 7 years later, 18 years later. I'm still needing information now to help parent my 50-year-old, adults who were adopted as teenagers or as in their 20s and now are coming up with new things that I need to learn how to manage in the family situation or with the grandchildren. So it's that thing about it being a lifelong journey is said in such a cliche way, but the education and the opportunity to ensure that everyone has it does not follow that and needs to.
No, you open up so much, and I think the idea of this, I always say like, oh, April, stop. It's like cliche after cliche, and you're like, no. Openness also seems like a catchphrase or a cliche, like, oh, openness and open adoption, oh, right, but I want to go to Elliot because this idea of openness means we have to all be open about the conversation and the experiences of adoption, but you've got to be kind of open to going down deep into the matrix a little bit on this. So I know, Elliot, you talk about how openness is so important especially to healthy, holistic child development. So I want you to touch on that quickly, and then we're going to go to Gary and then Ridge, and then we're going to go questions.
Okay, thank you so much. So one of the things that's been occurring to me through this whole theme of education and also speaking of openness is just that, I'm an adoptive mother as well. So I remember somebody telling me once that, no matter what, whether you talk to your child about their birth parents, ever during their time of growing up, it's going to be on their mind. They're going to be on their mind every day. And that was such a difficult thing for me to take in because I just hadn't had a lot of experience with this whole adoption thing. And I guess one of the things that kind of bounces off of that for me for the current generation is this whole social media influence. And how I think that we're not getting, it's hard enough, I'm in my mid-50s, it's hard enough for me to stay on top of social media for my 12-year-old daughter and see what's going on with that. But also with respect to adoption, I think it's very important because these contacts are being made between, amongst everybody in the constellation through social media, and yet I don't think that we're talking a lot about, I don't think there's a lot of dialogue going on about how to usefully, to positively use this social media platforms for the betterment of everybody involved. I think that I've seen in families where it's kind of used as currency for, oh, you can't text your birth mother anymore because you misbehaved today, and things like that, that we never would have done previous to this time. So I think I'm just thinking about education and some kind of staying on top of things. That's an area that I just want to challenge all of us to maybe give some thought to with whoever you're dealing with in the adoption constellation today.
It's a modern way we're all living, right? We can't deny it, and trying to think it's going to be shut off in some way is just not living in reality. I lied. I'm not going to go to Gary because I started with you. I'm going to go to Ridge. This will be my last question, and then we'll go to the audience. So I want you to center on, Ridge, maybe one thing that you think 6WHAM, these adoption memoirs, what is it teaching people? How can it be a device to teach? I remember when we were in Boston and Hal, you came to see, you said, Hal said something that stuck with me, and I know it stuck with you. After he watched it, he said, wow, this feels like we've been led into a sacred space, right? And that just stuck with me, and it felt so powerful. And so what do you think people can learn after they watch your work?
Well, I very much appreciated Hal's comment because that's something that Derek and I diligently pursue. Sitting in front of a camera with lights on you, being mic'd, it can be a harrowing experience for anyone, much less sharing, something that is pivotal in your soul. So we try to create a sacred space because we want to hear their stories. We want to hear what's important in their narrative. What are they feeling? And so when people watch 6WHAM, I hope that they do feel that it's a sacred space. But I think that one of the most common comments we've received is, I'm not alone. I heard someone else saying the things that I thought only I thought. And so I think that one of the elements of 6-Word Adoption Memoirs is, no, there are other people out there, and their story isn't identical to yours, but it runs parallel, and you have something else, you have somebody else giving words, feeling a way, and I think that just lifts the burden. For those professionals who aren't a part of the constellation, I would say 6-Word Adoption Memoirs gives you a 25-minute opportunity to just see a range, and then to talk about how would I address that person if they were coming to me for some kind of therapeutic counseling.
I want to hold there for 1 second and invite anyone to the mics. They're centered at the front of the room. They're there. If anybody wants to jump up and ask a question, now's your time. And the clock's ticking. So, but I do want to continue on. Do you want to use the mic, or do you want to stay where you are? I'm happy to have someone grab the mic and bring it to you. Okay, good. Yes, please do.
I'm Rachel Brandt. This question is for Sue. I was an intensive foster care parent, have been, for children who have been traumatized by violence or sexually assaulted. When you talk about termination of parental rights being abolished, what do you do about the children that absolutely are not safe to go back into their homes? What is the substitute for that?
So thank you for the question. And I recognize, and I myself, I'm a parent of children from those backgrounds. I mean, those are the children we adopted as well. I recognize that not every, children have a right, the fundamental right question, if I had a chance to give more than one response. The other one is everyone has a right to be both physically and psychologically safe in their living environment and in the world. And so not everyone should be able to live with everyone else. And so children are going to sometimes come from parents or situations that are not safe for them to live with. And so there can be, and there should be, and even in those tribal customary adoptions, there are ways that you protect the safety of the children and you don't have them live with someone who's unsafe. That doesn't mean you have to legally terminate their rights. I think those are two separate questions. And that doesn't mean that there's no, once you terminate rights of a parent, you kind of cut off that whole part of their family tree. So children who had abusive or violent mom or dad doesn't necessarily mean grandma and grandpa and aunt and uncle and 3 generations back and everyone else in their entire family tree was. So that's part of why I feel so strongly about that. But I agree that children need to be safe and that they need to be in family settings where they can be safe and in relationships that nurture and heal. But I think that can be done in ways, and I think we can be instructed by some of the ways that it is currently happening, that can be done in ways that protect that safety, but also honor that part of their heritage and help them heal even through that. Part of healing is coming to terms kind of with that and recognizing that even though bad stuff happened, and even though bad stuff happened in my bloodline and that part of my family tree, doesn't mean everything about my identity is bad, doesn't mean everything about that whole, part of my ethnicity or my family is bad. And so I just think the legal construct becomes a problem to some of that healing. But I absolutely agree with you, children need to be safe and we need to protect them. So to me, those are two separate questions that both need thoughtful responses.
Anybody else have a question? Please, step right up.
Hello, I'm a lawyer, and I'm not even a recovering lawyer. I'm still practicing. I'm intrigued, Dana, by your comment, which I think many would agree with, that permanency faster is better and that the legal system is part of the problem. But the tension that I can't resolve is how do you support and work with the rights of the birth family and the human rights that the birth family may have to remain or have contact with the child. How do you do that quickly? I know the law about permanency planning, 18 months, a lot of people who represented birth parents said, that's too fast. We can't provide support services in that length of time, so you're wrongly separating people who are related. So how do we make those two things live together?
You mean you're going to make me try and figure out what to do about it?
Yeah, exactly. Thank you.
I think, that's obviously a huge issue. And I think that one of the ways we can start is by being more intelligent about how kids are cared for when they are in out-of-home placement. So once kids get into out-of-home placement, they shouldn't be bounced around to multiple homes. And that happens. And, I don't think there's a good standard of care that recognizes how important permanence is particularly for very young children in that kind of a situation. So I understand that it's very, very important to keep the parents in the loop and to make sure that their rights are protected. And because, as everyone has said, kids really want to be involved with their families. They don't want to be taken away necessarily. But they should be in an environment, and we should make sure that our social service safety net provides this in an environment that they're going to thrive, and not something where this incredible process of development that's occurring so early in life is not respected.
We've used the term, and we're going to go over here, but it's like, or I've used it like the competing interests of adults often hamper what is best for children. That's in divorce and remarriage. That's in sometimes school. So this is this idea of adults kind of pushing and pulling. It's mine. And that is just something that's just so difficult. But when you're faced with facts and data and outcomes that are so stark, like at some point you gotta really, and it's about education, making sure everybody is in the loop on some of these things, not just kind of willfully ignorant or turning away from it, right? So I just think that's a great question, and it's one of the biggest challenges I think we face in all of this work. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Rihanna. I really appreciate us having this conversation about centering people within their adoptive constellations and all the people that they're connected to. One of the things that I think about a lot is sibling relationships. I think even as we start to talk about birth-family contact, the people who we hear about and from are people who are adults who have some agency to try to advocate for that contact. And I'm wondering what you think the role of siblings should be in foster care and in adoption, and how we can center those conversations about other children in care or out of care and the importance of those relationships. And that's for anybody.
What do you think, Sue? You want to take that one? Yeah, I think.
Thank you for the question. Okay. Thank you for the question, and anyone else can jump in, but I'll start it because it's people who, part of my biography that didn't get shared was that we actually have 22 children in our permanent family, and the reason for that is because siblings. We adopted sibling groups, large ones, multiple times, which was not our plan going in. But that's what happened because we became so passionate, and all of our kids had been separated in care before, and some of them separated for many years. So it is something I'm really passionate about, and I know Imani talks about, and Gary has talked about, and others. But I really do think that siblings as children and then siblings as adults should, have a say, should absolutely be considered when we look at what's in the best interest of a child. If that child has siblings, what's in the best interest of that child can only be answered when you ask also what's in the best interest of the entire sibling group. When how we first ended up adopting a group of 6 siblings who were all teens and older, some in their 20s, was because we were asked to adopt just one of them. We didn't know, we were called about this child, 13 years old, all these needs, can we adopt him? And then we learned he had 5 other siblings, and we're like, well, we're not talking to you about him unless we talk about all of them. And we had to be very subversive in our advocacy for the other 5 because the agency was just fixated on the rest of them don't need family anymore. Those words were actually used. 2 of them have already aged out. The other 3 are in independent living. We're not looking for families for them anymore. So I think we have to get very intensive in our advocacy around listening. And yet the siblings, one of them who had already aged out, he moved 3,000 miles to join us at his own choice. And he quotes and he says all the time, I was willing at that stage of my life to move 3,000 miles to be reunited with my siblings. When siblings have acted out with each other, when they've perpetrated against each other violence or sexual or something, still separating them permanently doesn't necessarily heal those underlying wounds, and it doesn't change those behaviors that may now come out with someone else, but it adds more depth to their trauma. So even when there's been issues between the siblings, I think they have a right to still have a family relationship. They still need to be kept safe, so we need to look at all of that in a big picture, and including their voice is part of how we do that.
Can I add?
Yes, absolutely.
I was going to say, I think oftentimes there's a lack of, can you guys hear me?
Okay, keep talking.
Okay. I feel like the lack of transparency.
Yeah, I don't think so. I don't think it's. We're not picking you up, so you can take mine.
Okay, cool. All right, awesome. What's on? I was going to say the lack of transparency as well when siblings are being removed, it's really, really difficult. And as I stated before, I have several siblings. There's actually 10 of us, 5 on my father's side and 5 on my mother's side. And three of us share the same father. And so the 3 of us are the ones that were the only ones in foster care. And so we were placed together. And so when we got removed, it was really, really difficult. I think for a long time, I didn't even understand the impact of how difficult that was because I was placed with my older brother. But my little sister, I just didn't understand. We were really, really close and we were best friends. And then even at one point, my brother and I, when we were staying together, he was living downstairs with one sister and I was living upstairs with the other sister. But then I got moved. And I would say the good thing about that situation was that my brother and I still went to the same school. And my sister and I, we would still have, weekly visits, but it just wasn't quite the same. And I would say that, again, when us being, taken, there's just this lack of what's going on, and you just don't have any understanding of what's happening. So when you look at the trajectory of me, and then you look at the trajectory of my sister, it's very, very different. And so actually in November, she suddenly passed away, and she was my best friend. But we were super, super close, and so even in us being taken away from each other, we just stayed very, very, very well connected. And it wasn't even until a few years ago, because even where I was staying in another place, I wasn't allowed to even have any contact with my biological family. And so, and it was like for 7 years. And so after that, I immediately got out of that situation and connected directly with my biological siblings. And being able to have that connection again was something that just meant the world because, we said that we came in together and that we were going to leave together and that we were going to stick together through everything. And so When the system took us away, we weren't able to do that. And so I would say that, again, like, not necessarily being able to, I understand that there's an aspect of transparency and the aspect of being open, but also having a developmental approach to talking to young people about their situation is super, super important and very, very essential, because we're not stupid.
We have time for one more question. I know,
April,
but I think there was someone who was kind of hanging back there. I'm sorry.
April, can I just add one comment
Yeah,
that
super fast,
Monty's-
I think.
And so often it's said that siblings can't be raised in the same home because it's impossible to find a home that can meet all of their, or even both of their needs. We had one son with a severe terminal illness, which had behaviors and cognitive implications, and another brother, and we did eventually adopt both of them together, but the social worker told us the reason for separating them, they had been separated for a while, was that there would not be such thing as a family that was qualified to meet the medical needs of the one and the normal needs of the other one. And also the statement was made, and this child is so disabled he doesn't know he has a sibling anyway, so it doesn't matter. And something that you said just struck me, that we have to, again, and yet that child who had that terminal illness also had never been seen smiling ever. And when we got his brother back into the family, he started smiling. They thought it was part of his condition that he couldn't smile. And then when he got his brother back, he smiled. So there's never someone who doesn't know they have a sibling or doesn't have that. And there are such things as families that can meet multiple needs at the same time.
Amen. Last question.
Hi, my name's Nicole. I'm an adult adoptee. And this is kind of a question for Amani or anybody, but really focusing on that adult adoptee kind of time frame in the developmental. Because I think it's great that you guys are having all these open programs now, but I know for me, going through loss of my mother, and just even realizing that maybe reunification is a possibility, I think those are new ideas for some people that, you know, we're kind of on that cusp of the closed adoption, not so much. And, you know, I'm trying to start a group, I'm trying to reach out, but I really feel like I want to hear where you guys are at as far as where you think the progress can come helping adult adoptees, as you were saying, some 50 years old, some younger, and aging out, growing up in a quote-unquote stable environment, but still trying to, maybe you're at the well-being point, but also trying to find the safety, because I think that's very difficult. So I just wanted to hear anything that you've kind of run into dealing with adult adoptees.
I mean, what I would just say is that, like, the light bulb turned on for me in my 20s when I finally met other adopted people. And from that point forward, it was like my tribe. I found my people. I found people who I could call my 911. Do you know that you realize, oh my gosh, this happened at home, or oh my gosh, this during Thanksgiving, my uncle said something. Like, I think you're saying what a lot of us are experiencing and have experienced as adult adoptees. It's like, where's our place? So what's happening is we're creating it for ourselves. Support groups, informal, formal, they're happening. And the sad reality and truth is we are kind of responsible for doing it on behalf of ourselves, which again, we take that up because my family surely didn't do that. There was no programs in my group. So it's kind of like the leadership in this room and many of us who are creating space for us is generally led by us. So I don't mean to put it back on you to say, oh, start it. You are already starting something. But at the end of the day, that's kind of where we are, where it's got to be generated and created by those of us closest to the experience, or else it just doesn't happen. I mean, I think that's what I've learned. So, but spaces like this create the opening for it. So on that note, I will say thank you again to the panel. Thank you to Hal and everybody here. And thanks to all of you for your patience and your energy.